A 12-year-old girl walked down the aisle in an oversized wedding dress, her eyes screaming terror as a man 3 times her age waited at the altar in a frozen Alaskan church. Then she looked at the massive biker standing in the back and made one desperate hand signal that would either save her life or end his. Before we dive in, where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this brotherhood reaches across America. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button because we're building a community that believes in justice, loyalty, and standing up when everyone else stays silent. Now, let's get into the story of how one biker's choice in a frozen Alaskan church changed everything. The Harley's engine sputtered once, then twice, before Titus felt the grinding vibration that told him what he already knew. Something was wrong. Not mechanically wrong. Weather wrong. Alaska wrong. The kind of wrong that kills men on lonely roads. He'd been riding for 6 hours straight through the Alaskan wilderness, pushing north from Anchorage toward the Bering Sea coast. The original plan was simple: deliver a package to a brother up in Nome, turn around, and be back in civilization before the storm season hit. But nature doesn't respect the plans of men, especially not in this part of America where the land still remembers what it was before roads and cities tried to tame it. The blizzard had come out of nowhere, like God himself decided to erase the landscape. One moment, Titus could see the gray ribbon of highway ahead. The next, white. Just white. The wind screamed across the tundra with a fury that made his massive frame feel small, insignificant. Snow pelted his face like buckshot, each flake a tiny knife cutting exposed skin. He'd been riding for 31 years. Survived 3 crashes, 2 stabbings, and one particularly ugly bar fight in Reno that left him with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw. But this was different. You can't fight the cold. You can't intimidate a storm. You can only survive it, or you don't. The temperature gauge on his bike read -18. That was before the wind chill, before factoring in the speed of the motorcycle. His fingers, even inside his leather gloves, had gone numb 20 minutes ago. His beard, once jet black and now streaked with gray, had frozen solid, creating a mask of ice around his face. Titus squinted through his dark sunglasses, refusing to remove them even now. Some habits die hard. The veteran Hell's Angel had worn those glasses so long that taking them off felt like being naked. But the storm didn't care about his vanity or his comfort. The storm was impartial, merciless, and growing worse by the second. Then he saw it, a faint glow in the distance, barely visible through the wall of white. Light meant shelter. Light meant survival. Titus gunned the throttle, coaxing the Harley forward through snow that was already hub-deep. The bike fishtailed once, twice, threatening to dump him onto the frozen ground where hypothermia would finish what the storm started. The glow grew brighter as he approached, taking shape. A building. Timber-framed, old but solid, with a cross mounted at the peak of the roof. A church. Of course it was a church. Titus almost laughed at the irony, but his face was too frozen to manage more than a grimace. He killed the engine and practically fell off the bike, his legs stiff and uncooperative. The wind tried to shove him sideways, but his 6'4", 280-pound frame held its ground. He staggered toward the entrance, each step a negotiation with numb feet and unforgiving ice. The door was heavy wood, the kind they don't make anymore. Titus grabbed the iron handle and pulled. It swung open, and a wave of heat rushed out to meet him, so sudden and intense it actually hurt. He stumbled inside, and the door slammed shut behind him, muffling the howl of the storm to a distant whisper. For a moment, he just stood there in the tiny vestibule, breathing hard, his lungs burning from the sudden shift in temperature. Ice crystals fell from his beard and jacket, melting into small puddles on the worn wooden floor. He could hear voices inside, many voices, and the wheeze of an old pipe organ. Something was happening, some kind of service. Titus hesitated. A man like him didn't belong in churches, hadn't belonged in one for over 20 years, not since the day he buried his daughter and walked away from God, from faith, from everything that once mattered. But the storm outside didn't care about his spiritual crisis, and neither did his freezing body. He pushed through the inner door, stepping into the main chapel, and immediately felt every eye in the building turn toward him. The organ music stuttered, missing a note. An old priest at the altar froze mid-gesture, his wrinkled mouth hanging open. Titus realized what they were seeing. A giant in black leather and dark sunglasses, his vest covered in patches that told stories of violence and brotherhood. His presence a violation of the sanctity they'd built in this remote corner of Good News Bay, Alaska. But he wasn't leaving. Not yet. Not until he understood why the entire congregation looked so terrified, and why, at the front of the church, a little girl in a wedding dress was walking toward an altar where a man 3 times her age was waiting. Titus pressed himself against the back wall, trying to make his massive frame smaller. Impossible, but he tried anyway. He peeled off his frozen gloves, flexing fingers that screamed as blood flow returned. The church was small. Maybe 60 people packed into wooden pews that had been worn smooth by generations of faithful hands. But these hands weren't clasped in prayer. They were clenched in fists, resting on laps, trembling. The organ resumed playing, but the organist kept missing notes, creating a discordant melody that sounded more like a funeral march than a wedding processional. Titus had been to enough weddings in his life to know what they were supposed to feel like. Joy, celebration, hope for the future. This felt like an execution. The girl couldn't have been more than 12, maybe 13, if you were being generous. The wedding dress was all wrong. Too big in some places, too tight in others, like they'd pulled it from a donation box and forced her into it without alterations. The veil covered most of her face, but Titus could see enough. Pale skin, wide eyes, lips pressed together so hard they'd gone white. She wasn't walking alone. 2 women flanked her, older women with hard faces and harder grips on her arms. They weren't bridesmaids. They were handlers, making sure she didn't run, making sure she reached that altar. The groom stood waiting, and Titus felt his jaw clench so hard his teeth ached. The man was at least 40, maybe 50, thick around the middle, with the kind of face that looked cruel even when smiling. He wore a cheap suit that strained against his bulk, and his eyes tracked the girl's approach with an expression that made Titus's stomach turn. This wasn't a man looking at his bride. This was a man looking at property he'd just purchased. Nobody was smiling. Not the guests, not the women holding the girl, not even the priest who stood at the altar with a Bible that looked ancient and worn. The priest's hands shook as he held the book. Was it age? Or was it something else? Titus scanned the congregation, his years of reading rooms and assessing threats kicking in automatically. The people here weren't dressed for celebration. They wore the plain, worn clothing of rural Alaska, flannel shirts, wool sweaters, practical boots, working people, poor people. But it was their faces that told the real story. Fear. Every single person in those pews looked terrified, like they were witnessing something horrible but powerless to stop it, or afraid to stop it. 3 men sat in the front row, and they didn't look afraid. They looked satisfied. One of them, an older man with silver hair and a face like weathered granite, caught Titus's eye and held it. The message was clear. "You're not welcome here, stranger. Mind your business and leave." Titus didn't look away. He'd stared down meaner men in worse situations. But something in the old man's eyes made his skin crawl. Certainty. The absolute certainty of someone who believed he was untouchable, beyond the reach of American law, this far from civilization. The girl and her handlers reached the front. The organ music stopped, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Titus could hear the wind outside, howling against the church walls like it was trying to break in, or trying to warn him to break out. The priest cleared his throat. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." His voice cracked on the word beloved, and he had to start again. The girl swayed slightly, and one of the women steadied her with a grip that left white marks on her arm. Titus saw it clearly from where he stood, saw the way the girl flinched, saw the way she looked down at the floor, refusing to meet the groom's eyes. This wasn't a wedding. This was something else entirely, something that happened in places where the American dream had been twisted into a nightmare, where isolation bred monsters and silence protected them. The priest continued, his words coming faster now, like he wanted to get through this as quickly as possible. The groom reached for the girl's hand, and Titus saw her entire body go rigid, saw her pull back just slightly before the handler squeezed her shoulder hard enough to make her gasp. Then the girl's head turned. Just a fraction, just enough for her eyes to find Titus in the back of the church, and in that moment, in that tiny slice of frozen time in Good News Bay, Alaska, everything changed. The girl's hand came up slowly, like she was fighting against every instinct screaming at her to stay still and survive. Her right hand rose to chest level, and Titus felt his entire body go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the blizzard outside. He knew that signal. Every brother in his chapter knew that signal. Hell, every decent American with access to social media knew that signal. Thumb tucked into the palm, 4 fingers wrapped around it. The universal gesture for help, created for moments exactly like this, when screaming wasn't an option. Vera held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds that stretched into eternity. Her brown eyes were pleading, desperate, filled with a terror so raw it punched through every wall Titus had built around his heart over 2 decades. Then one of the handlers noticed, slapped her hand down hard enough that the crack echoed through the chapel and the girl's head snapped forward. But those 3 seconds were enough. Titus had seen enough. The pieces clicked together like rounds sliding into a magazine. This wasn't a wedding, this was a sale. Human trafficking dressed up in white lace and Bible verses hidden in a corner of America so remote that nobody would ever know. Nobody except the people in this room, and they were either in on it or too scared to stop it. The priest was still talking, his voice a monotone drone about love and commitment and holy matrimony. The words were poison, a perversion of everything marriage was supposed to mean. The groom reached for Vera's hand again, and this time she couldn't pull away. His thick fingers closed around her small wrist like a bear trap. Titus felt something inside him shift. He'd spent 20 years running from his past, from the memory of his daughter Emily, from the moment he'd failed to protect her when she needed him most. She'd been 14 when the cancer took her, And he'd been on a 3-day run to Sturgis, South Dakota, too caught up in the Brotherhood and the bottles to be there when she drew her last breath. His ex-wife never forgave him. He never forgave himself. He'd told himself that he was a bad man who made bad choices, that redemption wasn't meant for guys like him, that the best he could do was ride hard, live free, and try not to hurt anyone else. But standing in that church, watching Vera trapped at that altar, Titus realized something that had been buried under years of guilt and self-hatred. Maybe bad men were exactly who God called on when the devil came to town. His boots hit the wooden floor with a sound like thunder. The entire congregation turned as Titus stepped away from the wall. Each footfall echoed through the chapel, a slow, deliberate cadence that said he wasn't asking permission. He was 6'4" of leather and muscle and barely contained rage walking down the center aisle of a church in the middle of nowhere, Alaska. And every eye in the building tracked his movement like prey watching a predator approach. The priest stopped mid-sentence. The groom's head whipped around, his face flushing red. The old silver-haired man in the front row stood up, his mouth opening to issue what was probably a command to stop, to leave, to mind his own damn business. Titus didn't stop. Each step brought him closer to that altar, closer to Vera, closer to a choice that would define whether he was still the man who'd failed his daughter or whether he could become something better. His chapter brothers back in Anchorage would probably call him crazy. You don't walk into a situation like this alone. You don't take on a whole village without backup. But his brothers were 200 miles south, and this girl didn't have 200 miles worth of time. She had right now, and right now, she had him. The 3 men from the front row moved to block the aisle. Big men, rural Alaska big, the kind of size that came from hauling nets and splitting wood and surviving in a place that killed the weak. The middle one, younger than the others with a scar running across his cheek, put a hand on Titus's chest. "Turn around, outsider. This ain't your concern." Titus looked down at the hand, then up at the man's face. When he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but carrying an edge that made the man's eyes flicker with uncertainty. "Son, you've got 3 seconds to move that hand before I move it for you. And trust me, you won't like my method." The man glanced back at the silver-haired leader, looking for guidance. That hesitation told Titus everything he needed to know about the power structure here. The old man ran this show, but the old man was still sitting, still watching, still trying to figure out if Titus was serious or just putting on a show. Titus was dead serious. The hand stayed on his chest for exactly 3 seconds. On the 4th, Titus grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it in a smooth motion that came from decades of bar fights and worse, and sent him stumbling sideways into a pew. The other 2 men rushed forward, and the church erupted. Titus didn't want to fight in a church. Even a man like him had some lines he preferred not to cross, but these men weren't giving him options. The first punch came fast, aimed at his jaw. Titus slipped it, countered with a body shot that doubled the attacker over. The second man wrapped his arms around Titus from behind, trying to drag him down with sheer weight. Big mistake. Titus drove his head backward, felt the crunch of cartilage as the man's nose broke. The grip loosened, and Titus spun free, his leather vest swirling. The congregation was screaming now, people scrambling out of pews, the organ player frozen at her instrument. The priest had backed against the wall, clutching his Bible like it might protect him. But Vera was still at the altar, still in the groom's grip, her eyes wide as she watched this stranger tear through her captors like they were made of paper. The groom was yelling something, dragging her toward a side door, trying to escape while Titus was distracted. Not happening. Titus put down the last man with a right cross that sent him sprawling, then vaulted over a pew with surprising agility for someone his size. The groom saw him coming, shoved Vera aside, and grabbed for something in his jacket. Titus saw the glint of steel, recognized the shape of a hunting knife, and adjusted his approach. "You don't charge a man with a blade unless you're ready to get cut." The groom lunged, the knife arcing toward Titus's ribs. Titus caught his wrist mid-strike, twisted until he heard bones grinding, and stripped the weapon away. The knife clattered across the wooden floor. The groom opened his mouth to scream, but Titus's other hand closed around his throat, cutting off the sound. "Where's her brother?" Titus's voice was a growl, barely human. "The girl's brother." "Where is he?" The groom's face was turning purple, his hands clawing uselessly at Titus's iron grip. Behind them, Vera's voice cut through the chaos, small and terrified. "Philip. His name is Philip. They locked him in the vestry." Titus dropped the groom like a sack of garbage, leaving him gasping and retching on the floor. The silver-haired man was finally moving, pulling something from beneath his coat. Titus saw the gun before the old man could level it, crossed the distance in 2 long strides, and delivered a palm strike to the man's solar plexus that sent him crumpling. The pistol fell, and Titus kicked it under the pews where it couldn't hurt anyone. "Anybody else want to try their luck?" He turned in a slow circle, taking in the congregation. Most were pressed against the walls now, terrified of the violence but not intervening, because they'd known all along what was happening here. They'd known, and they'd let it happen because that's what isolation does to morality. It erodes it slowly until wrong starts looking like tradition. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the groom wheezing and the wind howling outside. Titus looked at Vera. "Show me where they're keeping your brother." She didn't hesitate. Despite everything, despite the trauma and the fear, the girl grabbed his hand and pulled him toward a narrow door at the back of the altar. Her small fingers wrapped around his rough, scarred hand, and Titus felt something crack inside his chest. Emily used to hold his hand like that. Emily used to trust him like that, before he taught her that trust was a mistake. The vestry door was locked from the outside. Titus didn't bother looking for a key. He stepped back and kicked it once, hard, right next to the knob. The old wood splintered, the lock tore free, and the door swung inward. Inside, huddled in the corner among boxes of old hymnals and moth-eaten robes, was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 7 years old, his hands bound with plastic zip ties, tape across his mouth, his eyes huge with terror. "Philip!" Vera sobbed, rushing past Titus to her brother. She tore the tape from his mouth as gently as she could, and the boy started crying immediately. Titus pulled out his pocket knife and cut through the zip ties in one quick motion. The boy's wrists were red and raw where he'd been struggling against the restraints. How long had they kept him in here? Hours? Days? Long enough to break his spirit and use him as leverage against his sister. "We're leaving," Titus said, his voice soft now, gentler than it had been since he'd entered this nightmare. "Both of you. Right now." Vera looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd seen her, there was something besides terror in her eyes. Hope. Dangerous, fragile hope that this massive stranger in the leather vest might actually mean what he said. Getting out of the church proved easier than Titus expected. The congregation had learned their lesson. They parted like water as he walked back down the aisle, Vera on one side and Philip on the other, both children clinging to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had just collapsed. The groom was still on the floor, conscious but broken. The silver-haired man was on his knees, gasping for breath. The three enforcers had vanished into the crowd, smart enough to know when they were beaten. But it was the priest who stepped forward as Titus reached the door. The old man's face was wet with tears, his hands shaking as he reached out not to stop Titus but to touch his arm. "Forgive us," the priest whispered. "God forgive us all." Titus looked at him, at this man of God who'd been about to sanctify an abomination. "You want forgiveness? Call the Alaska State Troopers. Tell them everything. Make this right." He didn't wait for an answer. The storm outside had reached its peak, the wind shrieking like something alive and furious. Titus pushed through the door, shielding both children with his body as the cold hit them like a physical blow. His Harley was where he'd left it, already half buried in snow. It wouldn't start in this weather, not with two passengers. But 50 yards away, parked behind the church, he could see a pickup truck. Old, probably reliable, and definitely a better option than freezing to death waiting for the storm to pass. Titus carried Philip, and Vera stumbled along beside him, the wedding dress dragging in the snow. They reached the truck, and Titus tried the door. Unlocked. Because this was Alaska, and in places like Good News Bay, people didn't lock their vehicles. They couldn't imagine someone would steal them. Titus felt a momentary pang of guilt as he hot-wired the ignition, but it passed quickly. He wasn't stealing. He was borrowing, and he'd make sure it got returned with a full tank and an apology once these kids were safe. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. Titus cranked the heat to maximum, and within seconds, warm air started flooding the cab. He stripped off his leather jacket and wrapped it around both children, then put the truck in gear. The drive to the state trooper post in Bethel took 4 hours through some of the worst conditions Titus had ever experienced. The truck fishtailed constantly on the ice. Visibility dropped to near zero multiple times, and twice he had to stop and dig the vehicle out of snowdrifts. But he kept going because stopping meant dying, and these kids had already come too close to fates worse than death. Philip fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted and traumatized. Vera stayed awake, staring out the window at the white darkness, occasionally glancing at Titus like she was afraid he might disappear. Finally, about an hour into the drive, she spoke. "Why did you help us?" Titus kept his eyes on the barely visible road. "Because it was the right thing to do. Nobody else thought so. Nobody else was willing to pay the price." She was quiet for a long moment. "What's your name?" "Titus." "That's a Bible name." Despite everything, Titus almost smiled. "So I've been told." "Are you an angel?" Now he did smile, though there was no humor in it. "No, kid. I'm just a man who's done a lot of wrong trying to do something right." The state trooper post appeared through the storm like salvation itself. Warm lights, official vehicles, the symbols of law and order that meant civilization still existed even out here on the edge of America. Titus pulled up to the entrance, killed the engine, and finally allowed himself to take a full breath. He'd done it. He'd gotten them out. These kids were going to be okay. 2 troopers came out immediately, their expressions shifting from annoyed to alarmed as they saw the children. Titus gave them the short version, watching as their faces hardened with the kind of righteous anger that made him remember why he still believed in the American justice system, even when it failed. These men would follow up. They'd investigate. They'd make sure Good News Bay never hurt another child. One of the troopers, a veteran with gray at his temples and sergeant stripes on his sleeve, looked at Titus with a mixture of respect and curiosity. "You're the biker who stopped a wedding?" Word traveled fast, even in Alaska. "I'm the biker who stopped a crime." "We'll need a full statement." "You'll get one. But first, make sure these kids see a doctor and get them somewhere warm and safe." The sergeant nodded, already pulling out his radio. "You did good, brother. Real good." Titus watched as they led Vera and Philip inside, wrapping them in emergency blankets, offering hot chocolate and gentle words. Vera looked back at him once before disappearing through the door, and in her eyes, Titus saw something he hadn't seen in his own reflection for 20 years. Forgiveness. Titus stayed at the post for 6 hours, giving his statement, answering questions, drinking bad coffee that tasted like heaven after everything he'd been through. The troopers were thorough, professional, and visibly disturbed by what they were hearing. They made calls, coordinated with federal authorities, started building a case that would rip through Good News Bay like wildfire. As dawn broke over Alaska, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, the sergeant found Titus in the break room. "FBI's taking over," he said. "This goes deeper than we thought. Trafficking ring using isolated villages as cover. You might have just broken open something huge." Titus nodded slowly. "The kids?" "Already on their way to Anchorage. Foster care, temporary but good people. They'll be okay." "And me?" "You're free to go. Technically, you assaulted multiple people and stole a vehicle." The sergeant smiled slightly. "But given the circumstances, the DA's calling it justifiable intervention and borrowing without permission. You'll need to come back for testimony if this goes to trial." "I'll be there." Titus stood, stretched muscles that screamed from the combination of cold, fighting, and tension. He walked outside into the crystal-clear morning, the storm having blown itself out overnight. His Harley was there, brought in by the troopers who'd retrieved it from the church. Someone had even cleaned the ice off the seat. He mounted the bike, started the engine, and sat there for a moment, listening to the familiar rumble. For the first time in 2 decades, that rumble didn't sound like running away. It sounded like moving forward. He rode south toward Anchorage, toward his chapter, toward brothers who would demand to know where the hell he'd been and why he looked like he'd gone 10 rounds with a grizzly bear. He'd tell them the story. They'd buy him drinks. They'd call him crazy, reckless, and probably a few other things that weren't suitable for polite company, but they'd also call him brother. And when the story got around, as stories always do in the biker community, they'd give him a new patch. Not an official one, not something from the club, but a personal one. The kind you earned through actions, not words. The Ice Road Guardian. Titus smiled, his first genuine smile in years, and opened up the throttle. Behind him, in that remote corner of Alaska, 2 children were learning to breathe again. Ahead of him, in Anchorage and beyond, was a life that suddenly felt worth living. Maybe bad men could find redemption after all. Maybe the road to heaven started in the most unlikely places. Maybe, just maybe, Emily was looking down at him right now, seeing her father not as the man who'd failed her, but as the man who'd saved 2 kids because of her. He hoped so. God, he hoped so. The highway stretched before him, ribbon of asphalt cutting through the wilderness, and Titus rode toward home with a heart that had finally thawed. If you believe that real brotherhood means protecting the innocent, no matter the cost, smash that like button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe now because we bring you stories of bikers living by a code stronger than any law, stories of loyalty, justice, and redemption on America's open roads. Also, check out the 2 videos showing on the screen right now, specially crafted for you. Stories that prove heroes don't always wear badges, sometimes they wear leather.